In the chaos following the collapse of Sicilian authority in 1943, an old man from Villalba, named Don Calò Vizzini, silently stepped into the void. He wore no uniform and held no official office, but soon he was already in charge of his village. This was not a story about a gangster in the Hollywood sense. It was something far more dangerous and nuanced. Long before the war, Sicily faced a problem. The state existed, but only in some areas. In rural villages, justice was slow or non-existent, and contracts carried little weight without enforcement. Land disputes often resulted in bloodshed, leaving a vacuum that men like Don Calò filled with mediation rather than chaos. If you wanted land, Don Calò knew who could give it. If you had trouble, he could settle it. He could arrange protection not through violence first, but through permission, an invisible power that held communities together. A post-war Sicilian journalist would later observe, "For many peasants, the Mafia was not an enemy of the state. It was the state they could reach. As permission became habit, power became invisible, and control hid behind subtle networks rather than overt violence. When Mussolini's fascist regime tried to crush the Mafia, many believed men like Don Calò were finished. But they weren't. They waited out the crackdown, and their networks hibernated, ready to spring back into action. Arrests and crackdowns disrupted their operations temporarily, but the disputes and influence persisted underground. Networks never truly died, they merely went to sleep until the collapse of fascism under Allied bombs awakened them. In 1943, when the Allies invaded Sicily, they faced a new challenge, establishing order amid chaos. The enemy was gone, the fascists discredited, but stability had yet to return to the villages. The Allies decided to improvise, selecting men who knew the local terrain, could control crowds, and hated fascists. In Villalba, there was only one obvious choice, Don Calò Vizzini, the man who had already been guiding his community quietly. He was appointed mayor under the Allied military government, a former hunted man now representing authority. Years later, an Allied officer would casually remark, "We didn't choose saints. We chose men who could make the countryside quiet." And so the legend grew. People claimed the Mafia had helped the invasion, but the truth was colder. When power collapses, whoever remains standing becomes useful, regardless of past affiliations. Post-war Sicily was starving, food and fuel were scarce, and bureaucracy was impossible to navigate. Don Calò thrived in this chaos, able to move wheat, goods, and cut through red tape with ease. The real power was not just in the food he could procure, but in the permits he controlled, who could transport, who could open shops. Scarcity flowing through him, first as hunger, then as leverage, made him seem like the embodiment of order. To many villagers, he was not a criminal, but a stabilizer, a force that kept chaos at bay in uncertain times. And this was how power often hides itself, behind permission, behind invisible networks, rather than obvious violence. In September 1944, a dangerous political event shattered the fragile calm of Villalba when Girolamo Licauzi arrived to address landless peasants. He spoke passionately about reform, exploitation, and men who controlled land without owning it. Everyone understood whom he meant, those who held power in a system they didn't formally control. The speech was met not with applause, but with gunfire. Chaos erupted as shots rang out and people fell. Licauzi was wounded, and others were injured amid the violence, revealing a dangerous undermining of authority. Later in Parliament, Licauzi would declare, "The Mafia is not folklore. It is a system of power that lives inside our institutions." Don Calò was charged in connection with these events but was never convicted, leaving the message clear: authority was fragile. The event signaled that politics could exist here, but not in the way formal institutions dictated. It was a different kind of power. This story of Sicilian resilience, unbroken networks, and silently wielded authority illustrates the true nature of power. Shadows. The vanishing of formal rule did not mean chaos. It meant the emergence of a clandestine, adaptable web of influence. Power in Sicily was not just held by guns or laws, but by permission, by relationships, by the ability to keep the peace without a state. As the dust of war settled, the old networks reawakened stronger, more integrated into daily life than ever before. In this chaos, Don Calò Vizzini's quiet diplomacy became the new law, an unspoken, invisible code that brought stability. His story reveals that sometimes, when rules disappear, power doesn't vanish. It simply transforms into something more subtle and enduring. And the real stories of influence and control do not live in textbooks, but in the gaps between official history and everyday life. In the end, Sicily taught the world that authority can be invisible yet omnipresent, guiding communities when formal structures fall apart. The man who stepped into the void became a legend, an example of how order can be preserved amid the ruins. This is the story of Don Calò Vizzini, not just a man, but a symbol of resilience in the face of chaos. After the war, Italy feared communism more than organized crime, and landowners feared unions. The church feared revolution, and the state feared instability. And Don Calò understood something fundamental. He didn't need to rule Italy. He just needed to be useful to those who did. This wasn't conspiracy, it was alignment, as the Mafia didn't overthrow the state but embedded itself where the state was weakest. In 1947, at Portella della Ginestra, gunfire tore through a May Day celebration, and men, women, children fell. The blame officially landed on bandit Salvatore Giuliano, but questions never stopped. Who benefited? Who was threatened? Who stayed silent afterward? During later inquiries, one magistrate summarized the problem quietly. Everyone knew who benefited. The problem was that knowledge could not be turned into proof. Don Calò's name floated in the background. Never proven, never erased. In Sicily, absence of proof is not absence of knowledge. Don Calò Vizzini died in 1954, and his funeral was enormous, public, orderly, respectful. A Palermo newspaper noted the next morning, Villalba buried not just a man, but a way of governing that never officially existed. The state attended not because it approved of him, but because ignoring him would have been a statement. Don Calò protected himself with paper, deeds, permits, appointments, documents stamped by regimes that no longer existed but were never invalidated. If authority can be typed, stamped, and filed, no one has to admit where it really comes from. The Mafia learned how the state loses track of itself. In the late 1940s, young people began asking about land, not ideology or slogans, but ownership. They weren't eliminated but redirected. Careers stalled, articles vanished, families received friendly visits, and truth became expensive. Once truth has a cost, most people choose silence without being asked. Familiar pattern. Subscribe to Behind the Veil Truths to learn more. Decades later, anti-mafia judge Giovanni Falcone would write, "The Mafia is not an organization, it is a method." And Don Calò perfected this method early. Not power through terror, but power through inevitability. This was the true blueprint of control.